For game 1, Patrick starts us out. He plays a City of Brass for turn. He taps it for green, putting him to 39. He casts a Carpet of Flowers and passes the turn. Ryan plays a Snow-Covered Forest. He casts a Mox Diamond, discarding a Snow-Covered Forest. He taps both for green and casts a Priest of Titania. He passes the turn. Joe plays a Scrubland and passes the turn. Andy plays a Wooded Foothills and passes the turn. Patrick plays a Twilight Mire for turn. He taps City of Brass and Twilight Mire to make double green. He then casts a Bird of Paradise and Llanowar Elves. He then passes his turn. Ryan plays Wirewood Lodge for turn. He taps his Priest and Wirewood Lodge to cast his commander, Yisan. He casts a Quest for Renewal and then passes the turn. Joe plays a Plateau for turn and casts a Cursed Totem. He reveals that this is the reason he kept his hand and passes it to Andy. Andy plays a Misty Rainforest and passes the turn. Patrick moves to combat and attacks Joe with Llanowar Elves. Joe goes to 39. In his post-combat main phase, Patrick taps his lands and casts a Green Sun Zenith for 1. He grabs an Allosaurus Shepherd. After this, he passes the turn to Ryan. Ryan taps his lands and his Mox Diamond to cast Beast Within, targeting Joe's Cursed Totem. Andy responds by cracking his Misty Rainforest, grabbing an Underground Sea. He taps it for blue and casts a Swan Song, countering the Beast Within. Ryan then moves to combat and attacks Joe with Priest of Titania and Yisan, triggering Quest for Renewal twice and knocking Joe to 36. He then passes his turn.
Joe plays a Hallowed Fountain, untapped, bringing him to 34 life.
He then casts his commander, Timna the Weaver, and then he passes the turn. Andy plays an Urborg, Tomb of Yawgmoth for turn. He passes. In his pre-combat main phase, Patrick targets Andy with his Carpet of Flowers, adding 1 black mana. He taps his lands for black and casts Necropotence. Andy responds by cracking his Wooded Foothills, grabbing a tropical island. He casts Snapcaster Mage. Snapcaster targets a Swan Song. He casts the Swan Song, countering the Necropotence. Patrick then passes the turn. Ryan casts a Bird of Paradise. Then he moves to combat, attacking Andy with Yisan and Joe with the Bird token, knocking Joe to 32 and Andy to 36. He passes the turn, untapping his creatures during Joe's untap step. Joe casts a Brainstorm. He plays a Misty Rainforest for turn, then passes. Andy misses his land drop and passes the turn. Patrick again targets Andy with the Carpet of Flowers, this time making 2 green mana. He taps his lands and casts a Finale of Devastation for 2, grabbing a Dark Confidant. He attacks Andy with the Bird token, dropping him to 34 life. Patrick then plays Lake of the Dead, sacrificing his City of Brass. He then passes his turn. Ryan starts by moving to combat. He attacks Andy with Yisan and Joe with the Bird token, knocking Joe to 30 and Andy to 32. In his post-combat main phase, he casts a Tangle Wire. In response to the Tangle Wire trigger, Joe cracks his Misty Rainforest, grabbing a Tundra. He then taps Tundra, Plateau, Scrubland, and Cursed Totem for his Tangle Wire trigger. He plays Mana Confluence for turn. He then passes. Andy taps all of his permanents for the Tangle Wire, misses another land drop, and passes his turn. Patrick taps Dark Confidant, Allosaurus Shepherd, Birds of Paradise, and Llanowar Elves for the Tangle Wire trigger. He then reveals a Polluted Delta to Dark Confidant. He plays the Polluted Delta and immediately cracks it, grabbing Bayou. He makes 2 green mana from Carpet of Flowers. He makes black with Twilight Mire. He then sacrifices Twilight Mire to Lake of the Dead. He casts the Gitrog monster. He plays a Mana Confluence as his second land due to Gitrog. Patrick then casts a Crop Rotation, sacrificing Lake of the Dead, triggering the Gitrog monster to draw a card. Crop Rotation resolves, and he finds a Bazaar of Baghdad. He activates Bazaar to draw 2 and discard 3. He then casts a Chain of Mephistopheles. Joe responds with a Negate, countering the chains. Patrick moves to combat and attacks Joe with the Bird token, knocking him to 27, and passes the turn. Ryan starts by tapping Tangle Wire, Priest of Titania, and Birds of Paradise for the Tangle Wire trigger. He then casts Mana Crypt.
He taps the Mana Crypt and Wirewood Lodge to cast Umbral Mantle. He then equips the Umbral Mantle to Priest of Titania. He then moves to combat, attacking Andy with Yisan and Joe with the Bird token,
knocking Andy to 30 and Joe to 25.
After that, he passes the turn. Joe taps Scrubland, Curse Totem, and Plateau for the Tanglewire trigger. He then casts a Mana Crypt. He then casts a Gilded Drake. He steals the Gitrog monster with the Gilded Drake. He follows that up with a copy artifact as a copy of Mana Crypt. He moves to combat and attacks Andy with Tymna. During his post-combat main phase, he triggers Tymna to draw a card. After that, he passes the turn. Andy taps Snapcaster, Urborg, and Underground Sea for his Tanglewire trigger. He misses yet another land drop, and then casts a Vampiric Tutor so he doesn't have to discard at the end of his turn. Then he passes. Patrick taps Birds of Paradise, Llanowar Elves, and Allosaurus Shepherd to the Tanglewire trigger, and reveals Jiraga Tree Speaker to Dark Confidant, dropping him to 33. He then moves to combat, attacking Joe with the Bird token and the Gilded Drake, dropping him to 21. During his post-combat main phase, he makes 2 black mana with the Carpet. He then plays a Homeward Path and activates it. He then sacrifices Llanowar Elves to cast a Diabolic Intent. Andy responds with a Force of Will, paying 1 life and exiling a Tamio Field Researcher. During the end step, Ryan casts a Veil of Summer. Patrick then passes the turn. During his upkeep, Ryan taps Tanglewire and the Bird token to his Tanglewire. He also wins the Mana Crypt flip. He casts a Woodland Bellower. It resolves, putting a Reclamation Sage into play, destroying the Cursed Totem. Ryan then taps the Priest of Titania for 3 mana, activating Yisan. He searches up a Quirion Ranger. He then returns a forest to his hand to untap the Priest of Titania. He activates it, tapping it for 4 mana, then he uses 3 of that mana to untap it, giving it +2/+2 until end of turn. He repeats this process until he has 18 billion mana floating. He then casts a Thorn of Amethyst. Andy casts a Force of Negation, exiling a Supreme Verdict, countering the Thorn of Amethyst. Ryan then equips the Umbral Mantle to Yisan. He activates Yisan to search his deck for a 2-drop. He also repeats this process all the way up until 8. On 4, he grabs a Temur Sabertooth, and on 8, he grabs a Craterhoof Behemoth. He returns Craterhoof to his hand 1,000 times and casts it between each activation of Sabertooth. He moves to combat and attacks each other player with 1 creature, killing them.
You win!
For the second game, Joe starts us out. He plays a Scalding Tarn, casts a Mox Diamond discarding a Hallowed Fountain, and passes the turn. Andy plays a Polluted Delta and passes the turn. Patrick also plays a Polluted Delta. He cracks it, grabbing an Overgrown Tomb into play, untapped. He then casts Imperial Seal. Joe responds with a Stubborn Denial, countering the Imperial Seal. Patrick then passes the turn. Ryan plays a Snow-Covered Forest. He then casts a Mox Diamond, discarding a Snow-Covered Forest. He then casts a Winter Orb. During the end step, Joe cracks his Scalding Tarn, grabbing a Watery Grave, tapped. Ryan then passes the turn. Joe plays a Flooded Strand and immediately cracks it, grabbing a Plateau. He then casts Tymna the Weaver. During the end step, Andy cracks his Polluted Delta, grabbing a Breeding Pool, tapped. Joe passes the turn. Andy plays a Hinterland Harbor and passes the turn. Patrick plays a Snow-Covered Swamp and passes the turn. Ryan casts a Utopia Sprawl, naming green. He then casts a Sphere of Resistance. He then passes the turn. Joe plays an Exotic Orchard for turn. He then attacks Ryan with his Tymna. During his post-combat main phase, he triggers Tymna to draw a card. He then casts a Dark Confidant. After that, he passes the turn. Andy plays a Scrubland and passes his turn. Patrick casts an Occam Adversary. After that, he passes the turn to Ryan. Ryan, not having anything to do, does nothing and passes the turn. Joe reveals Muddle the Mixture to Dark Confidant. He then attacks Ryan with Timna and Andy with Dark Confidant. Post-combat, he triggers Timna, drawing 2 cards. He then plays a Marsh Flats, casts a Mana Crypt, and then passes his turn. Andy plays a Swamp for turn and casts a Praetor's Grasp, targeting Joe. He then passes the turn. Patrick attacks Joe with Occam Adversary. Patrick then casts a Collector Oof. He then passes the turn. Ryan plays a Dryad Arbor and passes the turn. Joe loses his Mana Crypt flip and reveals a Windswept Heath to Dark Confidant. During his post-combat main phase, Joe triggers Timna to draw 2 cards. He then plays the Windswept Heath that was revealed this turn. He moves to his cleanup step, discarding Snow-Covered Island and Codex Shredder. Andy plays an Urborg Tomb of Yawgmoth and passes the turn. Patrick attacks Ryan with Occam Adversary and Andy with Collector Oof. He then plays a Gaia's Cradle for turn and passes. Ryan attacks Joe with Dryad Arbor. During Ryan's end step, Joe cracks his Marsh Flats for a Badlands. He then casts an Abrade, destroying the Winter Orb. Joe loses his Mana Crypt trigger and reveals Praetor's Grasp to Dark Confidant. He moves to combat, attacking Patrick with Dark Confidant and Ryan with Timna. He draws 2 cards with Timna's ability. He then plays a Steam Vents, untapped, paying 2 life. He then casts a Praetor's Grasp, targeting Andy. After that, he passes the turn, discarding an Arcane Signet. Andy casts the card he got from Joe's library, Curse Totem. After that, he passes his turn. Patrick attacks Joe with Occam Adversary and Collector Oof. Patrick votes black mana with his Snow-Covered Swamp. He then plays Lake of the Dead, sacrificing the Snow-Covered Swamp. He then casts the Gitrog monster. He plays Windswept Heath as his second land. He then passes the turn. Ryan casts a Root Maze, then attacks Joe with Dryad Arbor. During the end step, Joe casts a Vampiric Tutor. In response, Patrick sacrifices a Windswept Heath, triggering the Gitrog monster, and he searches up a Bayou. Ryan then passes the turn. Joe loses his Mana Crypt trigger and reveals Time Twister to Dark Confidant. He then attacks Ryan with Timna and Andy with Dark Confidant. He draws 2 cards with Timna. He then plays Sea of Clouds for turn and casts a Demonic Tutor. He then casts a Gilded Drake and steals the Gitrog monster. He discards Tundra and Angel's Grace at end of turn, triggering the Gitrog monster. He then moves to clean up again and discards an Enlightened Tutor. Andy plays Kaya Orzhov Usurper. He uses the plus, targeting the Demonic and Enlightened Tutors in Joe's graveyard. He then passes the turn. Patrick starts by attacking Joe with Occam Adversary and Gilded Drake. He then plays a Verdant Catacombs for turn. He sacrifices Verdant Catacombs to Lake of the Dead to make 4 black mana. He then casts Demonic Tutor. He then casts Assassin's Trophy, targeting the Gitrog monster. Joe puts an island into play tapped because of Root Maze. Patrick then passes the turn. Ryan attacks Joe with Dryad Arbor. He then casts Llanowar Elves. After that, he passes the turn. Joe reveals a Bloodstained Mire to Dark Confidant and loses the Mana Crypt flip, putting him at 1 life. He then overloads a Cyclonic Rift. Patrick responds by casting a Force of Vigor, exiling a Llanowar Elves, to destroy Mox Diamond and Mana Crypt. Joe moves to combat and attacks Ryan with Timna, gaining 2 life. He chooses not to trigger Timna in the post-combat main phase. He plays Bloodstained Mire and passes the turn. During his cleanup, he discards Gilded Drake and Negate. Andy recasts Kaya Orzhov Usurper and activates it, targeting Angel's Grace and Gilded Drake in Joe's graveyard. He then passes his turn. Patrick plays a Forbidden Orchard for turn. He taps the Forbidden Orchard for green and gives the token to Ryan. He then casts Occam Adversary. He also casts a Collector Oof. He then passes the turn. Ryan casts Utopia Sprawl, naming green. He also casts Llanowar Elves. He then casts a Root Maze. Joe responds by cracking the Bloodstain Mire and casting a Fierce Guardianship, countering the Root Maze. He then passes the turn. Joe reveals Swords to Plowshares to Dark Confidant. Joe then plays Underground River for turn. He casts a Notion Thief. After the Notion Thief resolves, he casts a Time Twister. Andy responds casting Swansong, which Joe counters back with a Dovin's Veto. Before Time Twister resolves, Patrick casts a Veil of Summer. Joe draws a card. Then, everyone shuffles their hands and graveyards into their library, and Joe draws 28 cards. Regretting not casting the Swords to Plowshares before the Time Twister resolved, Joe casts a Preordain, puts both cards on the bottom, and discards down to hand size. Andy activates Kaya, targeting the Time Twister and Isochron Scepter. He then casts Atraxa and passes the turn. Patrick sacrifices Forbidden Orchard to Lake of the Dead to make 4 black mana. He then casts the Gitrog monster and passes the turn. Ryan plays a Snow-Covered Forest and casts Yisan. He then passes the turn. During Joe's upkeep, Dark Confidant triggers. Joe responds by casting a Brainstorm. He then allows the ability to resolve and reveals a Mana Confluence to the trigger. He then casts a Silence. While his opponents are silenced, he casts a Mystical Tutor, also during his upkeep, to grab a Demonic Consultation. He draws it for turn. He casts Jace, Wielder of Mysteries. He then resolves a Demonic Consultation, naming Demonic Consultation, exiling his library. He activates Jace's +1 and wins the game.
You win!